Isn't that how abuse of power always works? We're afraid of what we don't have, and so we grab after it. We're afraid of not being secure and safe and taken care of. And so we sacrifice others in order to ensure that we get what we want and get what we think we need. That's really what idolatry is all about. It's about sacrificing others to address our own fears and insecurities. What God does, what God is depicted doing in Psalm chapter 82, is he does away with those gods. That's what happens at the very end of this passage, by the way. He says to these so-called gods, let's look at it again, Psalm 82, I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like a prince. And then the congregation in worship sings, rise up, O God, and judge the earth. For all the nations belong to you. This judgment is not a judgment of you or me for thinking the wrong thoughts. It's not a judgment of you or me for not being good enough or successful enough. It's not a judgment of you or me for not saying the sinner's prayer or reading the King James Version of the Bible or reading the wrong theologian. It's not a judgment of you or me for getting the details wrong. It is a judgment of all of our tendencies to take our fears and turn them into practices of oppressive power and sacrifice. It is a judgment of those gods that we have held up to protect ourselves from what? From suffering. To protect ourselves from suffering. But all of life, whether we like it or not, involves some suffering, involves some pain, involves some failure. I love what Richard Rohr says about this in our book last month was this one. It's Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. But I wanted to read this piece to you because he's talking about this very thing, our tendency to run from our suffering, and because of that, to ironically create suffering for others. He says this, there must be, and if we are honest, there always will be at least one situation in our lives that we cannot fix, control, explain, change, or even understand. Is that true? For Jesus and for his followers, the crucifixion came and became the dramatic symbol of that necessary and absurd stumbling stone. Yet we have no positive theology for such necessary suffering for the most part. Many Christians even made the cross into a mechanical atonement to fit into their quid pro quo worldview, instead of suffering its inherent tragedy as Jesus himself did. Did you catch that part? See, Christ's death on the cross represents not just Christ's suffering for us, but our necessary suffering in life. Christ was crushed just like we often are. Christ absorbed the punishment of sin and death. Christ became the stumbling block that we often stumble over because we want to avoid that suffering. He goes on to say this, suffering does not solve any problem mechanically. It reveals the constant problem that we are to ourselves. And it opens up new space for learning and for loving. We take that one God who integrates all of life and experiences suffering with us so that we can enter into it. Now, there's, I think, an important final thing to say here, and that is this. Every time we talk about this, every time we talk about the idea that life involves suffering and that Jesus suffered and died partly in solidarity for us, it can very quickly become a kind of theological nihilism where we say, well, life is full of pain and suffering, and so all suffering can be good, and therefore no suffering really matters. But one of the things I love about this passage is that it makes a clear statement that all suffering is not good. Because at the center of this concern for how the other gods are used as an excuse to sacrifice human beings, God says, no, I am for justice. I am for peace. I am for fairness. I am for those who are weak and oppressed. And so somehow we have to do both. We have to take that God who integrates all of our lives and allows us to make meaning of our suffering, and then use that to come against all suffering that is meaningless. We have to be able to do both. The ancient rabbinical commentary on the Torah is the Babylonian Talmud, and it, I think, says this beautifully in a commentary on Micah 6:8. The Talmud says this: do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. You get that? I need to hear that. Because for me, my faith means that I stand not only in the midst of suffering, but that I advocate for the relief of that suffering and the solving of those problems that cause it. So it says this: do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Psalm 82 gives us a kind of dramatic framework for understanding that our way of doing this involves killing off our idols. All of those excuses that we have to try to avoid suffering and throw each other under the bus by doing it. And so when we talk about killing our idols, we aren't talking about like playing for the right team, like the right religious team, like we're the Protestants versus the Catholics on the softball field or something like that. When we talk about killing our idols, we're talking about killing off those things that we've created as a source of power that we use as an excuse to hurt other people. I can tell you what those gods and idols are for me. Respect. I really like to be respected. I really like it when other people think well of me. And there's almost nobody that I wouldn't throw under the bus if I thought it would get me a little bit more respect. That's when I'm at my worst. Part of killing off my idols means killing off my desire for respect and trusting in the one God who says, I don't have to earn respect because I am God's child. And that's all I need. Now, I could do this all day, but I won't. I have plenty of faults and plenty of idols that I have to kill. What I want to ask you is, what are yours? Who are the gods that you've established that give you license to trample on other people, to contribute to the suffering of others, or maybe just to cast a blind eye? The God of the people of Israel, the God of Psalm 82, the God who climbed on the cross willingly and suffered, is the same God that calls us to put those idols to death. Not so that we play for the right team, but so that we can help end that suffering.